Hello and welcome to Food Safety Fridays. My name is Simon Timpley from the International Food Safety and Quality Network. Today's guest presenter is Chris Domenico from Safe Food 360, and today we're going to the topic is practical steps for risk assessing suppliers and products within your supply chain. So we're very much looking forward to that. Firstly, say hello in the sidebar. Tell us where you're joining from. It's always great to see that. And Chris, good morning. How are you doing?
Oh, very good, very good. Good morning, and welcome everyone. And again, just happy to be here on IFSQN, and it's a pleasure to speak with everyone.
Great, and just let them know where you're joining us from today, Chris.
I'm actually located in Pennsylvania in the United States.
Very nice. And as you know, I'm in Manchester in the UK, wherever you're from, sunny Cornwall, Jamaica, Chicago, Ecuador, you're all very welcome. So, okay, so we'll play the video ads now, and then we'll be back for Chris's presentation shortly. Thanks to the sponsors who bring these webinars to you each week free of charge. You get a free certificate and a great presenter. And on that note, I'll hand you over to Chris. I'll be back for the Q&A later.
Apologies, I had my mic muted there. Again, thank you everyone for joining. Today we're going to take a look at the practical steps for risk assessing suppliers and products within the supply chain. Just a quick agenda here of what we'll be covering today. We'll be just taking a look at exactly what is a risk and what our challenges and concerns are. And we'll then kind of drill down through what risk assessments that we might carry out here, a matrix-based risk assessment or even a criteria-based risk assessment. And we'll then go through, give you some practical examples of what you might include in your own criteria-based risk assessment. But just a little bit about Safe Food 360. If you're not familiar with us, as Safe Food 360, we're part of a group called LGC Assure. And in that group, there's three other companies that we work with really to bring intelligence into the supply chain and intelligent management over all aspects within your supply chain. Safe Food 360 itself, we are a SaaS solution. We're a web-hosted software that there's more than 30 modules that are included in that license. So we don't individually sell these modules. They're all part of the solution. Essentially you pay one price for the license, and you'll wind up having all of the modules. And in those modules, there's many different modules that cover really the entire spectrum of your food safety program, your food safety management program, and even your supply chain management programs. In order to conduct appropriate risk assessments, we need to understand what risk is. And according to the World Health Organization, risk is the scientific evaluation of known or potential adverse health effects resulting from foodborne or resulting from human exposure to foodborne hazards. Within the supply chain, we have specific challenges that we're facing. We have more globalization. We're no longer sourcing our ingredients or materials from a local supplier. There's many companies, they actually are sourcing products that really relying on foreign suppliers, perhaps, for obtaining their ingredients. The regulations, they're ever increasing. There's not any regulatory body that's actually loosening up their standards or loosening up their regulations. They're just becoming more stringent. And again, they're presenting quite a challenge to the industry. And then we have changing consumer trends. And really over the last 2 years during the lockdowns, we've actually seen quite a change to these consumer trends, where folks are they're learning to change the way that they're eating at home, or the products they're sourcing at the retail level, at the market, and then even maybe when they're eating at restaurants. We have seen a complete change in how consumers are obtaining food and how they're actually consuming it. The challenges that we're facing specifically, suppliers pose a challenge to any organization. From the people, you think of the contractors that are coming on site. We have really everything from our pest control contractors to service suppliers, right down the board here. And we typically rely on maybe just background checks even for those individuals. However, there is risk in having those individuals just come on site, even your auditors, if you think. The processes, each department within your organization, within your company, they may manage supplier relationships differently from one another. Essentially, the left hand may not always know what the right hand's doing. More importantly, they may not be doing it the same way. Some of the shared concerns that we have globally, 1 in 10 people are affected by foodborne illnesses, and more than 420,000 of them are dying each year. And this is according to the statistics published by the World Health Organization. Food fraud itself, it costs a lot of money for the industry. I mean, whether it's in Britain, whether it's in the UK or the US, and really globally, there's a tremendous amount of money is costing food suppliers, food manufacturers, simply because of those issues. Food recalls, these are increasing. You can just go to your industry websites and your regulatory systems for understanding the alerts and what have you. And you can see that there are many recalls for specific issues. The recall process of these are inefficient. On the by and large. So just being able to obtain that product and claw that back from the marketplace, it's an inefficient process. And the learnings that we then have, they're rarely shared in the industry, and it's actually difficult to even share them. There's an increasing dependence on the global supply chain, as I mentioned here just a few slides ago. Really, we're sourcing our products from many foreign suppliers, and the food programs, our food manufacturing and the sourcing, the procurement of those ingredients, we're relying heavily on foreign suppliers. The increasing food trade volume, there's a lot of more products that are out there that have been developed, and with that, there's just an increasing dependence on sourcing those ingredients. And then there's complexity of the trade borders of essentially we have the open borders, and there is complexity involved in those. And then varying food safety standards and capability. And really, if you start to think about this here, is regardless of where you're sourcing your products from, your materials, your ingredients, those locations, they have their own set of regulations. On the other side of that coin, you have your own regulations, and we need to match these up. We need to be able to take into account those regulations and be able to meet them, both in ourselves, but also the products that we are sourcing. And they need to not only meet their own regulations, their own requirements, but then they have to be compliant with ours for us to be able to utilize them. And then really the food chain operators, and this can be argued, but greater than 95% of these food chain operators, they're small to medium enterprise locations, and they may not have the backing or the resources available to be able to make specific changes or to be able to make the changes in their own system to be able to become compliant. The major challenges that we're faced with are the visibility within that supply chain, and that's specifically the visibility down to the data. A lot of the information may be held in folders that have to go into a file, or just simply just logged or saved into our machines. And unless somebody is taking the time to complete or to enter that data into a system, into an easy to access system for everyone, really the data can simply just wind up getting lost. Or even the documents that we're requesting from our suppliers, they might be spread apart in various disparate locations. Cooperations across interested parties and stakeholders. Again, this kind of goes back to that thought of not everybody is doing the same thing. Maybe everybody in your organization, they're not following that same procedures. They may have their own way of doing things. And then we don't have secured permission systems, perhaps, where the product or the material documents and data is going to be locked down for us, and it's not going to be open for other prying eyes. And then we need to have an interoperable, usable, and affordable technology. And we can see even in the increases in the standards, specifically here in the U.S., we have the FDA is increasing their requirements, and they're really making those suggestions of ensuring that we have technology that's going to be helping us out to manage our processes. If we look at the food supply chain, really, if you take a 30,000 foot view of your supply chain, it's actually fairly simplistic. Essentially, you have the product really from farm to fork. If we think about it, it goes from the farm to the food manufacturer, and it might be transported out to a commercial retailer and eventually wind up on the plate of the consumer. However, if we drill down into that, your supply chain, it's actually pretty complex. There's a lot of entities within that supply chain. In that supply chain, if you look at every one of those entities, the more complex your supply chain is, the greater the risk, because there is risk associated with every one of those entities within that supply chain, whether you have a very a simplistic supply chain or you have a more extensive one. The assessment of the scope, or the scope of the assessments, I should say here, again, it can be simplistic when you're looking at that from that 30,000 foot view. It's essentially just completing that assessment and making the decision to approve your supplier. But once again, when you drill down into this, your own assessment programs, they can be quite complex. When you have that large supply chain, there's a lot of work. There's a huge drain on resources simply to have an effective assessment program. So why do we risk assess? The supply chain has many vendors that need to be assessed for the risk that they're posing into your organization. Once again, we go back to that previous slide. Every one of the entities in your supply chain are posing specific risks. The vendor risk analysis process should be in place to determine those weaknesses. And again, in that supply chain, there may be a weak spot. There may be a chink in the armor, so to speak, and we need to be able to identify that. Organizations implement risk assessment or risk management programs, and this is a formal way to evaluate, track, and measure the third-party risk that's posed to your organization. You want to assess the impact on all aspects of your business. And then from that, once we identify what the risks are, we then need to identify and build out those mitigation controls should that risk occur. And in that, we just simply want to minimize that impact on your business if that risk does occur. The requirements for conducting risk assessment, these come from various sources, whether that's your Gfsi schemes, or it could be regulatory bodies, or could even be the retailers, those, the technical standards that you might have. Specifically, if we look at the BRCGS requirements, the company shall undertake a documented risk assessment for each and every raw material. And this risk assessment, this forms the basis for the acceptance of those materials and what testing needs to occur. SQF goes on. They actually have the requirements for supplier approval. Your approved supplier program shall be based on past performance of supplier and the risk level. Again, at the risk level they're posing. The audits, the frequency of those audits, the type of audit you're going to conduct. This needs to be based on risk. Over here in North America, we have FSMA. FSMA requirements for your supplier programs. It needs to be based on supplier performance and the risk associated with the raw materials or other ingredients that you have. You need to provide assurance that a hazard that requires controls, that the hazard itself is significantly minimized or prevented, and include that hazard analysis of your food. What is the risk? Well, supplier management systems, they're frequently inadequate or inaccurate if there's no ownership. We have programs, again, where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing, where folks in your departments, in your procurement departments, they may not be doing things the same way. Everybody might be doing something different. If there's not somebody, if we think of a pyramid, essentially at that apex, if there's not an owner in there that has a vision for the company, they want to maintain the requirements across your entire supply chain so that you're properly identifying the risks, you're properly approving suppliers or not approving them. Manual process, these are prone to error. Again, your simple emails, just simply making the phone calls and what have you, and procuring and obtaining that documents. There is an opportunity for human error when we're not utilizing technology to ensure things are done consistently every time. There might be inconsistent cataloging of the data, and large companies, large enterprises, they actually have a particular challenge here because their business units, they may be spread apart, not just by various time zones, but there are some organizations where their business units really are spread across several continents or right around the globe. And then there's lack of consistent testing methods on those risks. Those quality professionals that we have in attendance here, they'd be familiar with Deming. And one of his quotes, he's had many quotes that you can find, but one of his quotes, it says, "Manage the cause and not the result." Deming, he came out with, he's the father of statistics and the father of total quality management. He came out with essentially a procedure or a process for conducting risk assessments or applying that into your system. It's a DMAIC. It's define the quality risks and then the owners of those risks. You want to measure and rank the risks, analyze current risk mitigation processes, impose the risk mitigation guidances or improve those risk mitigation processes, and then you want to control it. You need to monitor and the ongoing monitoring of those risk mitigation plans. we're going to go into looking at the risk assessments essentially here. So we have maybe a matrix-based program where you're really going to just look at the probability of a risk occurring, and then what that severity of the risk should that occur, and the multiplication. We're going to do a mathematical analysis here, and that multiplication is going to provide us with a nominal value. You can then apply that down to this matrix in this table and to determine what that risk would be, whether they're low, medium, or high risk. This risk assessment, the matrix-based risk assessment, food processors would use this, or retailers, distributors, and essentially historically they'd be using this. And when it would be used, this type of a risk assessment, it's more specific, or it's more suited for maybe a food safety plan, your HACCP plans, and the development of that, because the structure of this is a simplistic risk assessment model here. This is qualitative because it's providing with that nominal value, and it's based on variable quality data, or simply just an opinion. One of the drawbacks in that is that risk assessment, it is very open to opinion. Based on what the number, where you can actually massage that number to make it fit what your desired outcome would be. There's another risk assessment. It's a criteria-based risk assessment. In this criteria-based risk assessment, really how we're going to approach this is we have the criteria for all of the risks that where we want to know specific information. Each one of those criteria, then you can apply a weighted score to it, because each one of those criteria, some are going to contribute more to that final risk, and some will contribute less, obviously. But again, the combination of all of those criteria, the results of that criteria, that's going to provide you with that risk level that you would like to apply here. And who might use this is you have your like government agencies, research centers. Typically how this is used, or when this is used, is when you're conducting very, very complex, very large risk assessments across a large data set, across a very large population. And this is more suited where different and multiple factors can impact the risk itself. Then in the structure of this, obviously, this is a more complex criteria model, and it utilizes in all of the criteria, it utilizes various hazards and its objective factors here. And it's also then based on scientific data. The trend within the industry is actually we're moving from that matrix risk assessment more towards a criteria-based risk assessment. We look at this. We have the certification. This is now a requirement of Gfsi. Certification typically allows assumptions to be made based on the data, based on the assessment of a third party about that risk, and really to determine the overall risk of an organization. To be identified, these are the more traditional aspect of risk assessment, but it's important nonetheless. So this can include application of very specific hazards that are associated with the product, and then shelf-stable product. So again, the risk can be applied appropriately, and there's some different criteria we would want to be looking at. The vulnerability that's posed here, that's present. This is an emerging requirement. FSMA, Gfsi, they're requiring vulnerability assessments within your supply chain, and the process that's assessed for risk of the intentional adulterated product. The country of origin is also important. So really increasingly the country that product's sourced from, or that material sourced from, this can have an impact on the likelihood of issues occurring. We'll take a look here in a little bit here as far as what you would be looking at, and where you can even what resources you might be utilizing here. This can be based on statistics, and it's very well suited into this risk assessment. You want to make sure this is part and parcel of your risk assessment. And then also then your exposure. This can relate to the quantity of materials or products produced. Obviously, we think about that as if you're simply you're using once a year versus a product you might be using 1,000 pounds per week of is going to be different for those. Some sample criteria, and I'll give you a minute here to take a look at all of these pages. I have several of them listed, but these would be maybe criteria you'd use for a generic supplier. And I see some chat messages here that they can no longer hear the audio. Is that, would it be a ability?
I can hear fine, Chris.
Okay. On this then, some of the criteria that you would be able to utilize here is you have the, is that supplier, are they Gfsi certified? Have they achieved some sort of a third-party certification? Do they supply certificates of analysis? Has there been a recall in the last 24 months? By looking at whether a company has had sanctions opposed to them, or if they've had recalls or alerts over a specific recent period of time, that can indicate their risk level for us, or what that risk level for that particular criteria might be. Do they have a food defense plan? And is that food defense plan, is it efficient? Is it a well constructed food defense plan? You might request to actually see that and obtain that document. Do they have allergen controls in place? Again, we'll look at the volume of the products. I mentioned, perhaps there's maybe a micro ingredient we're only using once a year versus that product or that material we're using a substantial amount of more frequently. Does that facility or does that company have a history of food fraud? And then once again, we go ahead and we look at that country of origin, and perhaps we're going to look at the specific governance indicators that apply to that specific geographical location. Sample criteria for perhaps a meat supplier. Again, we want to look at, are they certified to a third-party standard, to a third-party certification? Have they achieved that? Have they obtained that? The species, specifically here for a meat supplier, is that facility, are they a multi-species site? Are they manufacturing? Are they using several different species within that one facility? Do they share the production lines, or do they have specific designated lines for those species? Is there an opportunity for some cross-contamination there, or some cross-product intermingling of the products? Or do they have specific species sites dedicated? Do they have foreign body controls in place? And then those, more so, do they have those controls in place? And then do they have acceptable limits applied to them? So, think of, do they have a HACCP plan that has been scientifically evaluated? Do they have allergen controls in place? The supply chain itself, are there a number of steps from when that product leaves that ingredient from that manufacturer to you? Do they have that history of food fraud? And then, of course, is that facility, is it a fully integrated facility, or is it simply just a slaughterhouse? For an ingredient supplier, we might want to look at, are they issuing certificates of analysis? Do they have those available? Will they have those available to you? And we look at the cross-contamination control program. Do they have a policy in place to ensure that we don't have that cross-contamination, or that they don't have that cross-contamination? Does a supplier have a vulnerability assessment that's really covering the ease of access to those raw materials, or ease of access within that supply chain? What about the availability of adulterants? Are there materials? Are there chemicals? Are there maybe some maintenance lubricants, what have you? Are they available? Are they readily available? And then you want to look at also the nature of the materials. It may change the potential for food fraud. So, your spice blends, single ingredients, what have you. The allergen controls, do they have the allergen control program in place? Just to say here is we go back to looking at the recalls that have occurred. I mentioned there's a lot of recalls that are occurring in the industry, and one of those recalls that is seemingly happening with more frequency is an allergen type recall. Do they have a foreign body control in place? And is there, importantly here, is there historical evidence of substitution? Without naming names here, we all might be familiar with over the recent decade, 2 decades here, there might be a supplier perhaps where there was actually substitution that occurred without the knowledge of the future receivers of that material, and that actually led to really some sicknesses, and sometimes there was actually a few deaths occurred with that. So we want to look at that. Do they historically simply just source or substitute their product? And we also then want to look at in our HACCP plan and in their HACCP plan, that we want to look at the processing steps, and are they properly evaluated? For a packaging supplier, pretty simple here. We just want to look at what the packaging type is. Is it a primary or secondary type packaging? Are they accredited, and what type of accreditation do they have, and what was the grade that they had achieved? Do they have allergen programs in place, and is that facility located in a high risk country? And then are controls in place for foreign body control again? And mentioned there with acceptable limits defined. So we're gonna build out the risk criteria here we're gonna build out that risk assessment itself. So we can take the information that we have defined in our criteria, and now we want to kind of throw this into this table here so that we want to name each criteria that we have developed here, and that we can define them from the previous sections. Display the maximum rating for each of those criteria, and then you want to define the percentage of that total risk. Remember here in that one diagram I showed you have the criteria-based risk assessment that we're building out. Each one of the criteria needs to have a specific weighted risk associated with it, because hey, look at that criteria list there, the categories. Some of those categories, some of those criteria, they are going to contribute more or less than to that overall risk. Once we've completed that, we would then want to define what the range of the measurements there, how that's going to essentially produce the risk here for us. So enter the risk designation, and it could be low, medium, high, or you may actually configure your own type of risk designation. Define the range on that risk. Want to develop a complete description of that risk. You want to ensure that your team members, your entire team, they have an understanding if actions may be required there, and then if controls are required in place here. Define the rating. This is significant in terms of food safety. So again, that risk, is it a significant impact? Yes or no. Then we move on to assessing the associated risk. We want to define what the basis of that risk is. If there's any guidance, or if there's any type of regulatory information, we want to retain that. We want to make sure that that's included and easily sourced, easily accessible. Then rate each one of those risks there. Some of the resources that you have available to you. You can go to the World Bank, for instance, and look at the specific governance indicators. You're looking at things like the voice and accountability. We look at the political stability and violence, if there's an absence or even a presence of violence, and the effectiveness of that government, and really, are they following the rule of law? Do they have that included in that geographical region? And how are they controlling corruption? Go back to that recall I was just speaking of, where a company may have substituted their ingredients without the knowledge of the end users, without the knowledge of that manufacturer. There's the opportunity for corruption here without your knowledge. And really, when you think about this, you're taking on that risk of that third party. There at the World Bank, there you can download a full data set for that, and a recent data set. Some other alerts, and really we can look at information that's available to us. If you maybe for over in Europe, and from the European Commission, you can access the RASF portal, for instance, where you're going to have the food and food safety alerts, where you're going to be notified of them. And then you might also want to look at the FDA's website, where you're going to see that listing, a current listing of the recalls and safety alerts that may have been applied in the industry. So we're kind of bringing this to a bit of a close, and I see we're quite a bit early on this. But how to conduct that risk assessment? Here's one of the learnings that we would have out of this webinar here. Is it's a multi-step process here. The first step of this, it's determining the assessment itself. What are those criteria? Determining what data we actually need to collect. Is it a questionnaire that we simply need to have them fill out, or are you collecting the data for that? Are you collecting documents? You might have a raft of documents that you need to collect for specific category suppliers. You may obtain very different documentation from your packaging suppliers that you'd be obtaining from your ingredient suppliers or chemical suppliers. The next step would be the collection of all of that data. We want to notify that supplier. We want to tell them, okay, here's what we need to collect. Here's how, the information that you're going to need to assess that particular supplier. If there's any data that then needs to be corrected, of course, we want to employ an effective corrective analysis or a corrective action program here. Because now we're going to utilize that information, the data that we collected. We're going to conduct that risk assessment. This first risk assessment we're doing, this would be in the absence of controls. We haven't determined if there's controls necessary. This risk assessment is going to assist us in determining whether controls are in place, because that next step, that's specifically the determination of controls. So we may want to go through maybe a decision tree type format where we're going to answer specific questions that we've developed so that we can then understand, are controls necessary for this particular step? Maybe it's a step in our programs. It might be the full supply chain program, the assessment program. If we determine that controls are necessary, we then want to document the plan for that. So essentially we're going to document the who, when, what, where, and how we're going to control that risk. That leads us to another risk assessment, but this one we can carry out with the controls in place, in the presence of those controls. We've collected the data, we've risk assessed it initially, we've determined controls need to be in place, so now we can conduct one more risk assessment. And this risk assessment really should allow us to have a much lower risk associated with them, because we've identified those hazards, we've identified the risks, and now we're able to control them. And then we can finally approve, or again, we may not approve that particular supplier. Having applied that activity, there are new challenges then that we're faced with from data collection. Just collecting that data, there's a volume of data that we need to collect, the documents that we need to collect. So the challenges then, they're simply just requesting that information and then collecting it, really filing that information, and then having that access to it. How are you going to make sure that your team has access to the data that you have collected? The scenario, you may have a customer that comes back to you and they might request, I want to know who's supplying you and where the material was produced. We want to know a lot of information, background information for that particular ingredient, and you need to be able to readily make that available to your clients, to your customers. How are we going to communicate? Primarily, communication is through emails. And this can be time consuming. There's tracking, and it just requires significant human resources to be applied and to maintain that. And then the follow up of your suppliers, should they not provide sufficient data, or maybe some of the data that they have provided to you, and it's for instance, maybe they supplied a certificate, for instance, that's set to expire. You want to be able to follow up on that to ensure you're going to have the most recent and up-to-date documents in your files. The follow-up of that, this can be very difficult. This can be a back-breaking exercise, and there can be little value add to your team, as your team is simply just chasing paper around. Developing those assessment models that we just went through, the appropriate risk assessment model and the workflows need to ensure that the requirements are met. And this can be, once again, a challenging process for your team to develop and have that consistent assessment program. And how are these workflows even going to be designed? The resources for conducting all that, for maintaining your systems, for managing that program, adding more resources, just throwing more people at this system, it's really no longer a viable option. Customers and companies, they're not simply having an endless supply of revenue in their budget where they're able to just add to the head count at the company. That's being reduced all the time. So given those challenges, how are we going to face them? How are we going to correct them? How are we going to take the steps necessary to improve that? And this is really kind of a challenge that's up to the industry to decide, and the industry to come up with best practices for how we're going to meet those challenges. With all of that said, we can go ahead and open things up to maybe you have some questions, and I'd be happy to answer them. I will say, just first and foremost, I may not have the answer to all of your questions, but absolutely I can be able to point you in the direction where you would be able to find the suitable information. And in some cases, it simply may come back to you on some of these questions. So, Simon, if you're there, maybe perhaps we can start going through some of the questions. If you've
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. Let's get rid of the slides. Thanks very much for that. So first question from Bruce. On the slide that talked about trend of moving from matrix to criteria, it mentioned that FSMA was moving to certification. Can you explain what that is? Certified for what, how frequently, and when was that introduced?
Sure. I mean, if you think of the FSMA certifications, essentially it's really the passing their regulatory audit, maybe, and really in terms of looking at your system to ensure that you have the proper systems in place, whether that's from the procurement of your local supplier materials, or even the FSVP, your foreign supplier verification programs. Do you have these programs in place? So that's I guess to speak to that.
Okay. Question from Mohammed. Let's get it up. Some suppliers do not approve the visit or audit in their place. What to do in such case, mostly in case of a single and big supplier? Yeah, so where you can't get access to audit a facility, what can you do?
I'm assuming here, are we talking about maybe the manufacturer, or maybe yourself? Are you able to actually go on site to conduct that audit? And in those places, I would assume what you can do is then rely on the obtaining the results of any third-party certification. We looked at that as some of the criteria. Or are they certified to a third-party certification standard? Are they certified to perhaps Gfsi, for instance?
Yeah. Question from Bonita. This might be just a comment. Need to note that allergen recalls are often caused by labeling errors, not cross-contamination or incorrect ingredient used.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point, because you actually look at that listing of your recalls. And not only are there those allergen recalls, but then one of the larger contributors to it are simply just mislabeled product, and where something's maybe perhaps not called out for that.
Okay, question from Malenga. How are allergens controlled? What kind of allergen control mechanism should a food establishment put in place?
Sure. The isolation of the, I mean, we think of when that product, that truck hits the docks and they deliver that ingredient to you, you may have an isolated location specific for that allergen. But then as you're using the allergens, it's the best practice would be to perhaps dedicate one line for using the allergen. I mean, we have one line we continually run nuts on, or that we occasionally run the nuts on. We're not going to utilize that in any other line. But then between runs, obviously we want to have a thorough sanitation process. And then once we have sanitized that line, once we've cleaned that line, then how are you going to evaluate that has actually occurred and that it's efficient? So you may want to conduct some sort of maybe an allergen check, for, or is there anything that's still present?
Okay. Samantha, how do you go about getting your HACCP plans scientifically verified?
Your HACCP team itself, these should be comprised of folks within your company that are the cross functions. So we can look at, obviously the processing supervisor may not really understand or know the hazards that might be associated in the warehouse, for instance. So we want to include folks from around your company, but then your HACCP team, the HACCP reviewers, for instance, these need to be qualified individuals. They need to be individuals who have gone through HACCP plan essentially building those out. And also these should be folks who have some sort of scientific knowledge themselves, for that, perhaps a food scientist that might be on board, who's going to be able to properly assess your HACCP plan and the risks that you have identified, the hazards.
Okay, question from Milda. How does your software help to tackle these issues?
The software itself, it really allows you to take your paper-based programs and convert them into an electronic system, so that you can define what that process, in the sense of your assessment programs, for instance, you can assign or define how your product's going to be assessed and exactly how you're going to carry out that risk assessment, whether you're going to use that risk-based risk assessment or a criteria-based risk assessment, and automatically create that decision tree that's going to calculate your answers and let you know if controls need to be applied. So this you can actually start to develop that consistency in that program. And as that's conducted, as those activities are conducted in the system might automatically notify the supplier that the assessment needs to occur at the moment. So then you don't need to apply human resources to this, where you have your team members, again, chasing paper around. The software can really automate that system and essentially provide efficiencies through your programs.
Thanks, Chris. Question from James. Is it better to have country of origin as a criteria or country of manufacture?
I'm not sure that there's much of a difference with that, to be honest with you.
Okay. Question from Guilia. How can you standardize and validate your scorecard rating system for suppliers to assess risk of using that supplier?
Okay, so as far as a scorecarding goes, or your compliance card that you would like to build out, what you're going to want to do, obviously, is to kind of collate, or you want to collect the information that you're using or that you're obtaining during that assessment program. But not only the assessment program, really from that scorecarding situation or that aspect, we want to look at ongoing activity and actually ongoing the receipt of those ingredients, and are you raising corrective actions? So, essentially here initially when we're conducting that assessment, was this a difficult process? Was it did they provide all of the documentation you requested, or is this just a problematic supplier? And during that assessment program, were there corrective actions raised, or were there specific hazards, high-level hazards that have been identified? And we want to combine that information to provide that score, and then maybe an ultimate score for that supplier.
Okay, Julio, how is the BRCGS Food Safety 9 approach to risk assessment in terms of suppliers? Are there any significant changes in this regard or new approaches?
That's actually, I would say there's to be clear on that, is the BRCGS scheme is yet to be published. And of course, there's always that opportunity for changes, for edits to be made between now and then. But I believe we should have a forward look at that scheme here probably towards the end of this year. And at that time, we'll actually, our team of professional services and our technical team, the food technologists, they'll actually tear that scheme apart, and we'll be providing perhaps a blog or what have you regarding the changes from edition 8, from version 8 to version 9. That information, unfortunately, I'm not able to give you a definitive answer today. That would actually be forthcoming.
That's great. We'll look out for that. That'll be very useful. Question from Karen: how to improve food safety culture in a facility?
That's actually a very good, and that's an issue that I believe from QA managers, food safety managers across the industry are faced with that. So, because I'd say, historically, we go back 20, 30 years, and this all this activity, it landed on the lap of the QA manager, for instance, and it was really the operations. They operated one way, and then it was the job of the QA manager when it came time to have your audit or to have that the regulatory body come in and evaluate your facility. It was the QA manager's job simply to just get that individual right through the facility, get over to the record review, and let's pass this audit. And company was very happy with that. But really, with the onset of Gfsi, for instance, and particularly is this food safety itself and the ideas of that. This is the responsibility of everyone in your organization. So that you have to have that buy-in from the top down, and when that's driven from that top down, we can actually then see this change throughout the organization. So you're really obtaining that top level buy-in is extremely important.
Yep. Question about Safe Food 360. Is there a conference in 2022?
I would absolutely hope so, because it's actually been several years. It's I believe the last one that we had was back in 2020, and we actually had it over in Dublin. And I very much remember that one because that was the start of the pandemic, and I was in Dublin, Ireland when they imposed that travel ban from Europe to the U.S. So that was actually a very interesting time, and to get all of our U.S. clients back over and ensure they're able to get back over to the U.S. So with that said, I would love to assume we're going to have that user conference, and but at the moment we have not completed any planned activities or even decided where we would actually host that. But absolutely, we'll be sending out some information regarding that if we do decide that a user conference will be held.
Yeah, just to be clear, Safe Food 360 are not the root cause of COVID. They didn't cause it. just coincided with that conference.
Yeah.
That's all.
I will say you brought up a kind of you jogged my memory here is during the lockdown period, during the pandemic, we actually had a massive increase in the usership of our software because so many individuals were at home. They actually worked remotely, so there's a lot of activity as far as the folks signing in to the software, accessing the software. This is cloud based, so they were able to access this outside of their own facility. But then when it came time, we might all remember the remote audits that we needed to have. And the Safe Food 360 really was built for a time like this. Though, to your point, we didn't know 10 years ago that a pandemic was coming, and we absolutely didn't cause that pandemic just to boost the software use.
Yeah. Okay.
I will also mention I like the name there.
Where's that? Oh,
Chris Domenico on the other one.
Oh, yeah.
Apparently somebody else has a similar name to than I.
Yeah. Is that the 6th? Chris Domenico the 6th? Oh,
yeah.
I think it's 6.
Impressive.
Wheelia, is there an example of a survey form risk assessment to evaluate suppliers? Is there anything on Safe Food 360's website? Any tools for risk assessment or evaluating suppliers?
Yeah, there actually is, and we have system tools that are available. So you can choose from using maybe like a matrix or simple matrix, or specific risk assessments that would be acceptable under the use or the terms of FSMA, for instance. But then there's also what's called a RAM. It's a risk assessment modeling tool, where you can go into that building that criteria based risk assessment. You can easily and quickly define exactly what that risk assessment would be. And if we go back to the slides, that if you think back to those slides, some of the graphics that I utilized in there are actually sourced right from the software. So again, we do have those features available in the system, so you can then create a very robust supply chain assessment program.
Okay. Question from Norel. For US vendors with suppliers, manufacturers overseas, specifically China, what are the kind of documentation can we ask from them? We already get the COA from the manufacturer and the self-assessment survey from the US distributor.
I think if we go back, and I believe we can make that the PowerPoint presentation available, or you're going to have the recording available. So, I absolutely, depending on that supplier that you have, you can go back to the source or to the samples that were provided for them.
Okay. Is having a scorecard a requirement? That's a question from Joy.
That can be a requirement based on your certification standard. Some of them absolutely do require them, and you can go back to the shall have. If that's mentioned in your scheme or in your requirement, then you would obviously understand it is a requirement that you have that. And I will also mention within our software that we do have the ability and the feature present to automatically create that scorecard and automatically score that particular supplier.
Okay, just a few more questions from Joanne. What are the important documentation on risk assessment of suppliers that is required by Gfsi?
Well, again, I guess it depends on the scheme that you would be being certified against, because all schemes are requiring just slightly different information. However, some of those I guess the documentation that you would want to be obtaining obviously is primarily your certificate, your do they have the country of origin? We want to know that, and what is the history of that particular supplier? Have they had a history of recalling the products, or has there been any type of a history where the products from that supplier have then impacted yourself, your own company, or companies similar to yours?
Yeah. Final question. What frequency of assessing suppliers? What would you recommend, Chris?
I would actually recommend maybe at least an annual basis to assess your suppliers, and some schemes maybe require assessment even greater than that every 2 years or what have you. So essentially, what you'd want to ensure that you're doing on this is having an initial assessment, and that might be a very complex, a very detailed assessment that you'd have, and then on an ongoing basis, you may simply just want to assess them based on you'd have a less stringent requirement for obtaining those documents, and you may not need all the raft of documents, or may not need to understand that we've already completed that assessment once to assess them, but then ongoing. You just want to ensure that they're maintaining that level of effectiveness that was initially assessed.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. That will do nicely. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for your time today, Chris.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. And we'll see you soon.
Okay. Take care, everyone.
Cheers, Chris.
Sure.
Okay, that's Chris Domenico from Safe Food 360. I'll put your certificate in the sidebar. You can download, and you can print and sign it, or you can open it in an image editing software and add your name that way. Thanks for joining today. We'll be back next week. Just watch out for the emails. We'll follow up afterwards with an email with the recording, slides, and certificate. And we'll put a link to Safe Food 360's website, because they've got some fantastic resources on there, lots of white papers and practical information. So, okay, thanks for your time today, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Friday. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. Stay safe and speak soon. Bye.